We're going to start. Yeah, so we have started recording the event. If for whatever reason you don't want to be on camera or something, you can close it. But it's nice to see people. Welcome everybody on behalf of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, Department of Mediterranean and Global Economic and Social History. Today is the first meeting of our workshop series, Commodities in History, Theoretical Reflections and Empirical Case Studies. I'm going to take a couple of minutes of your time to introduce the workshop series and what we're trying to accomplish. One goal is to bring scholars together who are working on within the field of the history of commodities writ large, and so that they can present their work and give each other feedback, promote an exchange of ideas. As you will see as you will probably have seen from the program that I have sent around, there are multiple commodities involved in time periods and approaches also. That's one goal. Also, this has to do, the second goal, with the fact that this workshop is part of the research project Value Chain Analysis of Tobacco in Greece. This is a project that has received funding from the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation, ELIDEC in its Greek acronym, under the second call for research projects to support postdoctoral researchers, project number 51. Sorry for sounding a bit bureaucratic, but I have to say it. Having this in mind, the second goal of this workshop series is to present the results of the project. And in fact, two of our presenters today will be presenting on aspects of this project. Those are Tryfonas Lemontzoglou and Dimitris Stergiopoulos. The project is pursues the goal of analyzing post-war Greece's most important export commodity up until the 1970s. And we approach the commodity as part of a long chain, or the result of a long chain of value-adding processes. Without wanting to get into much detail, I will just say that the project is based on three premises. One is that economic history, understood as the study of how the production, circulation, and consumption of goods and services changes over time, has to look at specific branches of the economy before it can make generalizations. And so the macroeconomic data, or the abstract dimension of the economy that are often used about industrial or agricultural output can benefit from, let's say, a more concrete or commodity-specific approach. Also, the second premise is that commodities are the result of a long chain of value-adding processes, and that the developments in one node of the chain can influence what's going on in another node or around that other node. So, for instance, in the case of tobacco, if there are changes in what people like to smoke in certain places, that can affect the lives of tobacco growers somewhere else in the world, or the types of policies that the state could pursue in tobacco growing regions. So again, what we're trying to do here is to both approach commodities from a variety of perspectives and also present the results of the project. Now, without going into any more detail, today we have a panel on tobacco in Southeastern Europe. And in the program, you will see that there are other topics as well. So today we have two papers on different aspects of the tobacco sector in post-war Greece. And we have one paper on tobacco trade between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. Before introducing the first speaker, I would like to let you know that at the end of this, or some months after the end of this workshop series, we will have, if everything goes well, a multi-author volume where you will have access. It will be a free access volume to the papers, or to many of the papers that will be presented here. Now, let's see. Herman, would you like to go first? Is that all right?
That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Good. So let me introduce you for a second. Herman is a doctoral candidate in history at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. He's working on his dissertation on the political economy of tobacco in Ottoman Macedonia and Thrace. His background is not only in history, but also in Middle Eastern languages. And I have known Herman for a few years now, and I know that his work is very interesting. So I look forward to his presentation. Herman, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Juan. Let me just pull up my notes. So before I start, I just wanted to say briefly that this week, for some reason, I'm not sure if it's because of the recent rains we've had here in Thessaloniki, but they've cut off my power a couple of times in the building. And so I don't expect them to do that again, but if they do, there may be a short period of time, 1 or 2 minutes with no internet, in which case I'll log back in as soon as possible. Now, on to the more important things. First of all, thank you to Juan, Dimitris, and Tryfonas for asking me to be a part of this panel and inviting me to be part of the conference more generally. I'd also like to thank everyone who's attending this session and who will be part of the discussions moving forward. I, for one, am no expert on value chain analysis or supply chain analysis, and so I'm sure that I will learn quite a bit from all of you. I come with my own perspective, my own background, having started out as a labor historian, but also being trained in cultural history, and increasingly over time becoming interested in legal and financial histories within the Ottoman context. So I know that the perspectives of so many of the amazing economic historians that are part of this project and this edited volume will be both informative and thought-provoking for me, and I hope also to add something of value as well, all puns intended. So in the diary of Hüseyin Hüsnü, the Turkish representative for the Mixed Commission in Kavala during the winter of 1923, he writes that tobacco was the most significant source of livelihood for Muslim peasants facing exile in Macedonia. His claim reflected a trope that had been used over 12 years beforehand by his partner in the Committee for Union and Progress, Rıza Bey, who was also the governor of Drama. So in 1923, merchants had refused to purchase that year's tobacco harvest from peasants, claiming, as they had done before, that its value was negligible. In reality, the value of this tobacco harvest from 1923 was well known, and it would be a significant source of tension and unease as Muslim peasants had to find buyers and organize efforts to transfer huge amounts of tobacco to Turkey with them, along with their other movable properties, which theoretically were protected under Article 8 of the Treaty of Lausanne. This dramatic experience was part of an ongoing debate over who and what instilled tobacco with value. It's obvious in hindsight that labor was a major part of the creation of value in this particular industry at the time. However, it's also significant to consider some of the political and financial networks which seized value by holding significant shares of the tobacco market itself. The history of tobacco in Ottoman Macedonia and Thrace is unique from the post-Ottoman period for 3 main reasons that are relevant to our discussion today. Firstly, the tobacco trade under the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, like many aspects of social and economic life during those years, reflected the authoritarian tendencies of this last effective sultan prior to the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. This was especially true in terms of the social policies which accompanied financial and monetary reforms intended to redeem the empire from its indebtedness to European creditors. The establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in particular, and the subsequent integration of many important commodity revenues into the orbit of international finance, would have a profound effect on the image of the state and its relationship to imperial subjects in places like Macedonia and Thrace, as well as Syria and elsewhere. In terms of tobacco, the domestic tobacco monopoly of the Regie Company was contracted with the Ottoman Public Debt Administration beginning in 1883. It would enforce new regulations on smuggling and create a complex system for the delivery, inspection, and financing of tobacco. As such, it was massively unpopular and would spark huge outrage in the decades to come. Most importantly, this would create a number of incentives for tobacco merchants and cultivators alike to circumnavigate the Regie in pursuit of quicker profits in the export trade of tobacco, and oftentimes by means of alternative forms of credit. By 1910, the Young Turks political apparatus, the Committee for Union and Progress, was organizing conferences to discuss new economic policies to replace the monopoly system and facilitate a state-sponsored credit supply. Debates emerged over whether this should take place through a corporate body, or whether whether it should take place through a corporate body acting in the interest of local tobacco merchants, or whether credit should actually be supplied through the agricultural bank of the Ottoman Empire's Ziraat Bankası. The agricultural bank was the preferred model, and in the brief period between 1911 and 1912, the credit that it supplied to cultivators increased significantly. Within the Greek context, the Mixed Commission for the Settlement of Refugees, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Greek Agricultural Bank would resume with some of the credit policies that had been abandoned between 1912 and 1924 for obvious reasons. The second aspect of tobacco in the Ottoman period that I want to highlight here is related to the first. There was a unique dissection of the tobacco trade between the export market and the domestic market during the last 3 decades of Ottoman rule, which I alluded to above. The scale at which tobacco was exported from Kavala to Trieste, Alexandria, and beyond was remarkable by 19th and early 20th century standards. Just for one example, even during the turbulent years between 1909 and 1914, the total amount of tobacco shipped from Kavala to Alexandria was something close to 3.5 million kilos, in spite of the fact that each of those years, moving consecutively forward, it dropped significantly because of wartime circumstances. Within this context, the regulations on exports were unevenly applied, allowing the most prominent tobacco merchants and tobacco companies to dominate the export trade to Central Europe and to Egypt, which were the most significant supply routes to international markets and to supply chains which were sources for the German, British, and American markets. The third point, the third aspect of tobacco in the Ottoman period that makes it unique is that the ethnic and religious makeup of those who cultivated and traded tobacco, as well as the geographic distribution of the populations involved, were significantly different during the Ottoman period from what they would become in the decades after Ottoman rule. However, there were also some continuities. These ruptures and continuities are significant in terms of how tobacco was traded, both legally and illegally, prior to the Balkan Wars, during the following decade, and in the period after the Greek-Turkish population exchange. Jewish commercial elites, as well as some Donme merchants based in Salonika, tended to dominate much of the Central European and Egyptian trade routes, while Greeks, many of whom had been categorized as smugglers during the Regie period, traded in Ottoman and in Greek territories and exported tobacco to Egypt via the islands, via some of the islands such as Samos. Bulgarian and Macedonian traders also played a smaller role in some of the land routes through Bulgaria to the north, while Muslim elites in Kavala and Drama were deeply invested in tobacco throughout the decade of war between 1912 and 1922, as they had been for years prior. Such a diverse demography was also spread throughout Macedonia and Thrace in ways that were important to the tobacco trade. Most importantly, the Jewish and Donme elites in Salonika and a sizable business community of Greeks and Muslims in Kavala relied on a predominantly Muslim population in the countryside to cultivate tobacco. With the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Asia Minor in the early 1920s, this dynamic, of course, changed significantly. The gradual expulsion of Muslims from Drama, Ceres, and elsewhere would also contribute to the transformation. The commercial networks, which were most prominent in the tobacco trade during this period, had a unique place within each of the three phenomena that I've just briefly alluded to. Jewish commercial elites in Salonika were well poised to exploit their political privileges and good standing with the Ottoman dynasty to avoid many of the risk factors and transaction costs that other less prominent merchants had to absorb after the establishment of the regime. Likewise, their reliance on Austro-Hungarian and Egyptian market networks gave them an added layer of protection against the fluctuations on the domestic Ottoman market for which the regime had its monopoly. Hence the bifurcation of the tobacco market between the export market and domestic market that I mentioned earlier. Lastly, the fact that these commercial elites remained rooted in the commercial center of the province Salonika, Thessaloniki, meant that they continued to hold large market shares in other industries such as railroad construction and other public works projects, bread making, beer brewing, textiles, mining, and ceramics, to name a few. One of the industries that these commercial elites were deeply invested in was that of institutional credit, i.e. through banks and corporations. Excuse me. Too much Oriental tobacco. So the Alatini brothers and their financial partners in Vienna, Paris, London, and Istanbul in particular are some of the most important institutional actors in this regard. From the 1860s, Solomon Alatini was exporting tobacco to partners in Central and Western Europe, while also trading with Muslim and Donme elites in Salonika and Istanbul. As early as 1863, the Alatini brothers had been guaranteed the right to freely supply the Austro-Hungarian tobacco monopoly with high-quality Oriental tobacco for Viennese manufacturers. By the 1870s, the Alatinis were the main suppliers of this Austro-Hungarian monopoly, and in 1883, after the establishment of the Ottoman domestic monopoly, their role in the Austrian supply route would be reiterated by an agreement made between the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman governments and the financial conglomerate that backed the Régie Company. The establishment of the Banque de Salonique some 5 years later in 1888 was therefore, in many ways, the embodiment of financial networks which had already been established between the Alatini brothers and the French, German, and Austro-Hungarian banks that they worked with. The Banque de Salonique, as an entity incorporated in Istanbul under Ottoman law, gave these financial networks a legal and institutional inroad within the expanding agricultural and industrial sectors that the Alatinis were invested in. It was the Banque de Salonique, for example, which would lend the government much of its needed capital for the construction of a railroad into Bosnia-Herzegovina. In 1890, the Alatinis would be accompanied by the Oriental Tobacco Trading Company as an institutional supplier of the Austro-Hungarian monopoly. And by 1893, the Banque de Salonique itself would gain the rights to also supply the Ottoman monopoly, giving the Alatinis a comically large share of the Macedonian and Thracian tobacco trade as suppliers of the two most important monopolies involved. This privilege would then be passed on to the Commercial Company of Salonika Limited when it was incorporated in London in 1895 by Lazzaro Alatini, giving the family yet another institutional hold in an internationally significant financial market. In any case, the commercial company eventually stopped supplying the Régie Company as it was significantly more profitable for it to focus on export markets. And this was a policy which would continue to pay dividends, metaphorically speaking, until well into the interwar period. In 1925, a report written by Rafael Atias would estimate that the commercial company of Salonika Limited was purchasing around 3 million kilograms of leaf tobacco per year, in spite of a decade of financial instability and war prior. Likewise, estimates of Assicurazioni Generali demonstrate that the commercial company of Salonika Limited remained one of the most important exporters of tobacco, operating with one of the largest amounts of capital in the industry and provisioning David Schnur, the partner of Philip Reemtsma, with a significant amount of product. This was in spite of the many difficulties, both economic and political, that the company and the entire region had faced between 1912 and 1925. From a brief preliminary analysis of the financial data available from company records of the commercial company, which are quite limited, the limited Ottoman legal documentation on Bank Salonik in the commercial court, and from reports written by the General Administration of Macedonia after the Greek conquest of the region, it's quite clear that the commercial networks of the Alatinis and their partners continued to play a hugely significant role, both in the supply of tobacco on the international markets and in the supply of credit within supply chains themselves throughout the 70-year period between 1860 and 1930. Therefore, the significant value of tobacco was seized in large part through the domination of the institutional credit market by their commercial and financial networks. As such, it's crucial to understand the process whereby these networks dominated credit markets and diversified their portfolios within many different agricultural and industrial settings, using corporate forms in Central and Western Europe, the Ottoman domains, as well as in Egypt. Value and supply, in the case of the Ottoman tobacco industry, are absolutely intertwined, and this interdependency of raw goods and the financial supply move us beyond discussions of the commodity or of capital as holding some sort of natural market value. Instead, value is created, seized, and distributed through complex processes of labor, smuggling, incorporation, and financial diversification. Although I've only analyzed here one aspect of the value chain of Oriental tobacco, that of institutional credit and the role of the commercial company, and I have not significantly discussed the question of labor, I still argue that the credit market and the broader political economy of finance is an equally important aspect of this history, and one we need to understand in tandem with those other aspects. To conclude, I'd like to briefly recall the anecdote I mentioned at the start, in which Hussein Husnu, representing the Mixed Commission for the Resettlement of Refugees and writing from his vantage point in Kavala, would emphasize the crucial value of tobacco within the political economy of ethnic cleansing. His focus was, of course, on protecting the immovable properties of the Muslim refugees who were preparing to leave Drama, Kavala, and smaller towns, such as Pursichan and Pravi, or Prosotsani and Eleftheroupoli. Based on what I've briefly outlined here, it's perhaps unsurprising then that representatives of the commercial company in Xanthi and in Drama would speculate on new harvest tobacco in 1923 and in 1924 for quote unquote good deals. In the documentation, they use the Turkish terminology kelepir, while at the same time, Muslim peasants and merchants petitioned to the Turkish government and the League of Nations for reimbursement of their movable and immovable properties, the value of which could not be transferred to Turkey in its entirety. So with those remarks, I'll end my talk, and I look forward to any feedback today in the session, but also on the article that that was sent out earlier. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, Ernst Langthaler. I think you raised your hand.
No, I only uploaded.
Oh, okay. Good.
Sorry, Juan, can I ask something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Could you hear me? I'm getting some.
Yes.
Okay, there's
It's
some
all
comments.
good. It's just the last 20 seconds or so were a bit problematic, but we did hear you. So thank you, Herman. I think better if we first do I have prepared some remarks for, but and I'm sure we'll get some questions or comments from the audience, but I think maybe it's better if we first move on to all the papers and then at the end do a discussion together. So Tryfonas, would you like to go ahead and if that's all right, let me introduce Tryfonas Lemontzoglou for a second. He is a member of the team at the Value Chain Analysis of Tobacco in Greece project. He has a PhD at the University of Siena, Italy, in economics, and he's an economic and demographic historian. And in addition to working for the project, he also teaches quantitative methods for social research at Pandion University in Athens. Tryfonas, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Just give me a second to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes, all good. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you so much for your introduction. As you can see from the title of my presentation, I will present some new empirical evidence about the supply-side responses of Greek tobacco farmers to market incentives during the period from 1953 to 1964. This study tries to answer the following question. How did the Greek tobacco growers respond to price changes? Did they increase the quantity supplied every time prices go up, or they characterized by low or even negative reactions to market signals? Theoretically, we based on the new classical framework of analysis and more specifically on the law of supply, assuming that higher prices at the market can lead to increased quantity supplied. Among the scholars who have tried to investigate farmers' reactions to price changes, Schultz has introduced the hypothesis of poor but efficient farmers, arguing that small family farmers are similar to all other capitalist entrepreneurs. On the contrary, Sayanov has argued in favor of the so-called dual nature hypothesis, pointing out that small farmers behave differently from other economic actors, primarily trying to maximize the household needs rather than profits. Here, we map some of the previous evidence on farmers' reactions to price changes, taking into consideration different agricultural products in different geographical areas. Most of these studies consist applications took part in the Global South, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. At the same time, very little evidence is available with regard to Europe, a fact that shows the limited importance of agriculture within the mainstream context of Western societies. Industry and services have become superior to traditional agriculture in most Western societies and are still considered as optimal choice for boosting the economy. Within the above framework, two different scenarios of farmers' reactions have been investigated. On the one hand, small family farmers were found to act as economic men, behaving efficiently within the market context. This means that peasants respond positively to market signals by increasing production volumes at any time a price goes up. On the other hand, other scholars have provided evidence in favor of Sayanov's view by identifying very low or even negative supply reactions to price changes. This can be explained within the framework of the so-called dual nature hypothesis, suggesting that small farmers behave differently than other economic agents. In other words, farmers are often seen as utility maximizers rather than as profit maximizers. The quality of institutions have been applied, as well as geographical factors can also be viewed as main determinants of existing inefficiencies. Specific evidence on tobacco grower supply-side responses to price changes have shown positive reactions in most cases, However, not always in a very high degree of elasticity, which means that the degree of price elasticity of supply found to be less than unit, so low-level responses. The debate we described above about the role of traditional agriculture within the market context can be found even in the Greek framework of the post-war era. For instance, Kyriakos Varvaresos and Angelos Angelopoulos, both former governors of the Bank of Greece, have stated in favor of agriculture as a key factor in boosting the economy. Some others, such as Ioannis Ichthys, former Minister of Industry, and Xenophon Zolotas, another former governor of Bank of Greece, had a much more pessimistic view of Greek agriculture as a main driver of economic growth. In any case, the important role of tobacco in the Greek economy can be summarized as follows. Tobacco was important, as you can see, not only in terms of total country's agricultural output, but also in terms of aggregate employment. Its significance can also be examined in terms of export value, as well as in terms of access to finance concerning domestic trade. Technically speaking, we use a simple panel regression model with production or sales volumes as the main dependent variable, and market or state prices given by the state as the independent variable. We also control for possible unobserved time-specific effects might impact farmers' production plans. The sign of the coefficient of main interest, B, shows the way farmers reacted to market signals. The degree level of coefficient B informs us about the type of elasticity of supply, elastic and inelastic. Our newly created dataset, based on information collected by the National Tobacco Board of Greece, EOK in Greek, an organization formed in 1957 in order to implement the state policies with respect to the tobacco industry. We extracted annual data on production and sales volume, as well as average market prices by tobacco variety and geographical area. Other information related to farm incomes, arable lands, and state support programs are also available, at least at the aggregate level of analysis. Here you can see a photo of the way we manipulate the data. So, for instance, the left side gives us the idea on how we manipulate cross-regional data. We have different provinces: Eastern Macedonia, Central and Western Macedonia, Thiva, Peloponnese, islands. And the right side of the picture gives us an idea on how we work on cross-varietal data. So the Basma variety, Kappa Kulag, Mavra, Mavra Argus, Basi Barli. So the two different levels of analysis. Our regression estimates have shown that Greek tobacco farmers of the post-war period responded positively and significantly to market price increases for all three levels of analysis employed in this study. Degrees of elasticity of supply were found to be greater than 1, which means that we had the elastic responses. Greek tobacco farmers were also found to react positively and significantly to increases in prices given by the state through the implementation of state support programs, however, at lower levels compared with reactions caused by market forces. At the same time, results have shown the existence of a long-run causal relationship between production and sales volumes and market prices for Greek tobacco. This means that not only present prices, but also past prices have influenced farmers' production plans. Behind the general trends, a deeper level of analysis shows the existence of significant variations across different varieties. The large majority of varieties had significant positive, however, low responses to price changes. Different uses and different market orientation of each variety might explain persistent variations. For instance, varieties more oriented toward domestic markets, such as Chebeya and Mavra, were generally more sensitive to changes in market prices compared to export-oriented varieties such as the Basma. At the same time, neutral types of tobacco such as Kappa Kulag and Zichnomyrodata had higher response rates to price changes compared to flavored and aromatic tobacco. Geography also seems to play a crucial role in determining existing variations in farmer supply reactions. For instance, the areas of central Greece, such as Phthiotida and Phokida, had greater responses than the northern ones, such as Macedonia, while the southern areas, such as Peloponnesos, had low or even negative responses. Summarizing, we may state the following conclusions. 1. Greek tobacco farmers were found to behave rationally within the context of market economy. 2. The way they responded to price changes can be characterized as highly elastic, in a sense that degrees of elasticity of supply were greater than 1 in most cases. 3. Not only present, but also past prices of the product were found to influence farmers' production plans. 4. The existing divergent supply responses might be explained by the coexistence of different varieties with different characteristics, different uses, and different market orientation of each variety. Lastly, state intervention through support programs did not seem to negatively affect farmers' efficient behaviors. Farmers responded positively by increasing their production levels, even when prices given by the state were increases. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tryfonas.
Let me stop sharing.
So I'm seeing a message that says that my yes, that says that my connection is weak. Can everybody hear me? All right, good. So thank you, Tryfonas. That was short and sweet. This is, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but this is something that I will bring up with regard to Herman's paper later on, how prices could play a role in all this, but we will leave that for later on. After this paper on prices of tobacco and how they influence the decisions that tobacco producers make for the following year or for the number of following years. We're moving on to Dimitris Stergiopoulos and his paper, Making a Living in Tumultuous Times, Economic Policy and Agricultural Incomes in Greece's Tobacco Sector in the 50s and 60s. I have known Dimitris for some years now. I met him at UCSD when I was at University of California, San Diego, when I was a graduate student myself, and he's now a graduate student there. He is doing his dissertation on the business networks that reached Greece and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and early 20th century. And he is also a member of our research team. He has been working on the policies of the Greek state and vis-a-vis tobacco in the post-war period. So, Dimitris, go ahead, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, all good. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank so much everyone that made possible for me to participate in this research program. And the main reason is because I came across a theory. I love theories in general, but I had to read the global production network. And literally, as you will see in my presentation, it was more or less things that I was thinking about, the global chain commodity and the global value chain things, that certain things that I didn't like. And then I saw how global production network tried to address those issues. And also the other thing that I loved in global production networks, that it was trying to reinforce their intellectual origins to the world system theories, that was to a certain extent where everything started. So today in my presentation, I'm going to speak about how Greece, the Greek state, tried to fix the rupture that occurred between between northern Greece and the tobacco production networks that in the 40s and 50s. Sorry. So After the end of the Civil War, Greece had to literally reconstruct its whole economy. And it had two sources of credit for this. One was the US aid, and the other was export of agricultural products. However, things have changed considerably since the interwar period. And in Germany, the smoking public didn't want anymore to smoke cigarettes with Oriental tobacco, but wanted to smoke cigarettes with the American blend, in which Oriental tobacco was only 5 to 10%. So, and this started to happen everywhere. That means that the demand for Greek tobacco was much, much weaker than it used to be. Moreover, Turkey used to export tobacco to the US, so Greece had a huge problem to export its product. So I will speak a little bit about global production networks, and then I will come back to the issue of the tobacco. So GPN can help us understand how certain regions flourish in a globalized economy by becoming part of a production networks centered around private companies known as elite firms. What we need to keep in mind here is that for this to happen, this region needs to serve the interests of those elite firms. This is the first and the most important thing. So, however, in order development to take place in a region, some amount of value has to be appropriated, has to be captured by the economic actors of this region. And this is the core of my presentation. How much of this value would end up to the producers of tobacco in northern Greece? So the two main issues here that is interesting to us, sorry, 1 minute. The two main issues here that is interesting to us is strategic coupling and value capturing. Strategic coupling is the process in which a region is connected to the production network of a lead firm, and value capturing is the process by which certain economic actors that are active in this production network capture some of this value. So the other thing that's important is that the national or regional state institutions, with the help of social and political movements, are responsible for enhancing the value that is captured by the regional economic actors. Thus, the relationship between state institutions and lead firms is simultaneously antagonistic and cooperative. So the other issue is that original GPN that appeared in the 90s and the early 2000s didn't care as much about state and state institutions. But lately, state policies are seen as instrumental for the coupling of the different loci of production and consumption. So here, the GPN theorists think that the strategic relational rating of the state requires attention to the configuration of social forces underpinning state support for particular policy directions, and how state hegemonic projects provide the basis for accumulation strategies of which GPNs form one important component. So, going back to northern Greece, in my paper, I studied which policies were pursued by the Greek state in order its economic actors in northern Greece to maximize the value they captured. The process of strategic coupling, decoupling and recoupling, and the process of value producing and value capturing are particularly important. In post-war Greece, the state had to decide which strategy of capital accumulation to pursue with its scarce capital that had obtained from its agricultural exports and the USA. Moreover, the fact that the state in the late 1950s decided to support the income of its tobacco producers demands from us to identify the configuration of social forces that led to this policy. So, as Tryfonas also mentioned, in the 1940s, an export-oriented, fully integrated Greek economy had been embraced by conservative, liberal, and social democratic politicians and economists. However, it was not clear whether agricultural exports were a viable accumulation strategy, how fast it had to transition to an economy specializing on manufacturing and tourism, or whether its orientation towards exports had to be combined with a program of import substitution. So the focus of GPN on export-oriented, investment-driven economic growth corresponds really well with the economic framework in which Greece aimed to accelerate economic development after Second World War. So by studying Greek economic policies, we can identify how Greece attempted to reconnect to the production networks of cigarette manufacturers and to maximize the value captured by its producers. So in my paper, I argue that the inability of Greece to export its tobacco in the 1950s can be understood as the decoupling of northern Greece from the production network of cigarette manufacturers. The Greek state addressed this problem by decoupling its region to these or other production networks. So, specifically, I will present the main events that led to the rupture in the 1950s, the action taken by the state in order this rupture to be repaired, and the outcome of these actions. So, as I mentioned, tobacco in the 1950s and 60s followed the post-war prices of the other agricultural products. The countries that specialized in agricultural exports had to export more and more in order to import the same number of industrial products. In the early 1950s, in comparison to the interwar period, Greece would obtain half the amount of hard currency for the same quantity of tobacco. This led the prices to be severely repressed and the producer to face an acute problem of survival. They could cover only 60 to 85% of their production costs, and their actual income had decreased by 30 to 40% since the interwar period, even if their interwar income had barely allowed them to cover their need. So, speaking as simply as possible, these people were so poor that is beyond imagination. This is what we need to keep in mind. So, and the average income of a farmer was half the income of the ones employed in manufacturing and services. So, moving on, since the 1930s, the production of tobacco had increased by 59%, the exports by 30%, and internal consumption by 9%. Thus, 20% of the yield remained unsold in the hands of the producers. This was a problem that Greek economy would face constantly in the 1950s and 60s. So in order to solve this problem, the state identified three solutions. First, it advocated the replacement of tobacco cultivation with other products that could be exported more easily. Second, it focused on recoupling northern Greece to the production networks of the cigarette manufacturers. Third, it complemented the income of the tobacco producers by intervening to the tobacco market. I'm not going to speak in detail about this, but what we need to know is that products like dairy products, animal feed, citrus, other fruits, vegetables, cotton, sugar beets, wine, and olive oil were seen as adequate alternatives to the export of raisins and tobacco. In overall, the state hoped that an export-oriented agriculture would help the poorer households to step out and escape the underemployment of the Greek primary sector. This could happen with them using the earnings from participating in a production network to find better rewarded jobs. However, and this is really important, this was beyond the reach for most producers due to the very, very low value that we're able to capture in the production networks of cigarette manufacturers. So these people were exporting their tobacco, but they remained poor. That was the main problem right in our case. So Greece also tried to strengthen its trade links with the countries that used to export its tobacco since the interwar period. But what was happening is that cigarette production in post-war Europe was increasing by 2.5 to 10% annually. So a viable scenario for the Greek exports was to preserve their market share and increase at the same rate with the production of cigarettes. However, this was never achieved, and Greece's market share remained stagnant or decreased. The one major event was the association agreement with the European Economic Community in 1961. Because more than 50% of the Greek tobacco exports were going to EEC states, Greece would face considerable obstacles to export its tobacco without this agreement, because the European community would protect agricultural production with import tariffs. However, Greece could not export more tobacco because Turkey and the United States could export their tobacco with the same terms as Greece, so tariff-free, more or less. They didn't have to pay tariffs. So the second was also the Greek state provided cheap capital to the tobacco merchants in order to export the tobacco. This is another very interesting topic, but not something that we need to speak about this right now. So lastly, in 1957, EOC, the National Tobacco Organization, Εθνικός Οργανισμός Καπνού in Greek, EOC, was established. Until 1957, the precursor of EOC was to disseminate more advanced techniques for the cultivation and curing of tobacco. But after 1957, the new organization had a much broader mission. It was responsible for intervening to the tobacco market, setting the limits of how much land could be cultivated, deciding the price floors, and subsidizing the income of the producers when the market prices were too low. Interestingly, the policies of EOC came into sharp contrast with the overarching economic policy of the state, which did not embrace such costly measures. Balanced state budgets and financing part of the public investments from the tax income was its main focus, so as to keep the exchange rate between drachma and dollar stable. Also, we should keep this in perspective, that the issue of the tobacco exports was not as important for the Greek political system. In the summer of 1957, shortly before EOC was founded, the two leaders of the opposition centrist party visited Thessaloniki, the main city in northern Greece, and gave an open speech in the main square. Even though both speeches were quite long, they mentioned only once the problem of the tobacco exports. So this was not something that we would encounter daily in the political discourse. So, right before the elections of 1958, elections quite famous in among Greeks, because it was the first time that the leftist party became the main opposition party, and this shocked the political establishment and the United States as well. So, right before the elections in 1958, EOC intervened for the first time to the tobacco market. The same year, the grading of the tobacco leaves by EOC, whether each bale of tobacco belonged to the high, low, or lowest quality, was introduced. The following years, the merchants recognized that the grading of tobacco contributed significantly to more peaceful contacts with the producers, because a third party decided about the quality of each bale. So, after this, what happened the next 10 years after 1957? Greece was able to dominate the exports of Oriental tobacco for only 2 years. In 1961 and 1962, one epidemic of mildew destroyed the produce in Turkey, Bulgaria, and Italy. However, the drastic decrease in the tobacco price paid to the producers after 1962 and the turbulent political climate of the early 60s in Greece led to dynamic protests. The one that took place in Xeromero in central Greece led to the death of the producer Panagiotis Vlachos by the police. Similar protests took place in the summer of 1963 in northern Greece due to the low prices offered to the producers and the dishonest tactics followed by the merchants. So in this context, in this conjuncture, EOC started to set price floors to protect the income of the producers, and price floors remained the constant feature of EOC policies until the late 80s. So when in 1964-1965, for the first time, a new government by the centrist party was in power and offered slightly higher prices than the ones by the merchants in order to force the merchants to give even higher prices to the producers. When the merchants could not buy tobacco, the merchants also could not buy tobacco after spraying, and producers and merchants were guaranteed that their surplus yield was to be bought by EOC. The tobacco producing regions in Eastern Macedonia and Thrace were given an extra subsidy, which amounted to 25% of the price of sold their tobacco. These actions protect the producers from the steep decline in the prices in 1963 and 1964. But because of all that, the state had to absorb large quantities of tobacco. While between 1955 and 1959, the state bought on average 10,000 tons per year, between 1963 and 1965, it had to buy 30,000 tons, with an annual cost of 300 million drachmas, or 0.3% of the Greek GDP. Moreover, as you see, the total cost for the tobacco subsidies was 851 million drachmas in 6 years. So the state would give something like 500 million drachmas per year towards the tobacco sector. And this is a very important expense because, as I mentioned, Greek state did not pursue welfare policies at that time. However, these subsidies amounted only for 10% of the income of the producers, and the rest came from the prices offered by the merchants. So, because of this intervention, in 1966, the state had accumulated 70,000 tons, which was a year worth of exports. And the amount of tobacco that the state had to buy each year because it could not be exported was increasing constantly. As I mentioned, the production of cigarettes increased annually by 2%. According to the economic plan of 1965, tobacco exports had increased annually by 1.1% between 1960 and 1965, but they were grow annually only by 0.8% in 1965 to 1970. So it was expected to have the slowest growth among all agricultural products except raisins. So also, AO, in order to undertake all this mission, had to grow rapidly and to hire more people. So, in order to conclude my presentation, in the integration of a region to world economy, essential is how and by whom value is created, who captures it, and how it is distributed between members of the asset-owning class. In this case, our tobacco merchants and the international cigarette manufacturers can be the asset-owning class. Contemporary economic mechanisms allow the value to be created by an economic actor and to be captured by a elite firm which controls the production network but does not own most of the economic entities participating in it. This uneven relation allows the passing of costs and risks from the lead firm to smaller firms. The relationship between the main leaders of the tobacco producing households and their family members who offer their labor for minimum pay in post-war Greece corresponds really well to the role of petty commodity producers in contemporary global South. Furthermore, the task of tobacco merchants to buy the tobacco as cheap as possible on behalf of the cigarette manufacturers is another form of a small firm that survives because the lead firm does not want to directly engage in low profit activities. The state itself also participates in the process of value capture. As Quentin and Campbell mentioned, it is instructive to recall at this stage that socially useful work funded out of tax receipts is another category of unproductive labor. What this suggests is that the trends driving the deepening of the smile curve could equally tend towards a growing public sector with adequate provision of housing, education, healthcare, and sanitation for increasing numbers of people, if states could capture the surplus in the form of tax rather than capital, rather than the owners of capital. The states, including the Greek one, try to capture some of the produced value in the form of taxes instead of being captured by the cigarette manufacturers. Additionally, the state returns some of this value to the producers by supporting their income through the policies of EOH. It also gave them the opportunity to cultivate other products or to find better jobs in manufacturing and services. Moreover, the return of some of this value was necessary in order the post-war Greek state to deepen, to secure its legitimacy in a region where it had supported the communists during the Civil War, and a lot of its people belong to religious or ethnic minorities. Let's not forget that a very large amount of the tobacco cultivated in northern Greece was cultivated by Muslims. And it's interesting that rarely we encounter any references to the religious or ethnic identity of the tobacco producers. Greece, alongside Turkey and Bulgaria, could have controlled completely the exports of Oriental tobacco. They could form a special partnership with the major cigarette manufacturers and provide them with a high-quality ingredient necessary for their product. This special partnership would have permitted economic actors like producers and merchants in northern Greece to capture a larger part of the produced value due to their stronger position in their dealings with the tobacco industries. However, these intentions were undermined from the interchangeability of Oriental in the American blend. Additionally, the weakness of the post-war Greek state to define how its regions were integrated into the international production networks led to the relations that enabled only very limited value to be captured by economic actors in northern Greece. Overall, Greek tobacco sector in the 1950s and 60s reveals that the ability of the state to define how its regions are integrated into the world economy also decides how much of the produced value is acquired by its actual producers. Supplementing the income of the tobacco producers was the best alternative for the state to the unequal relation between tobacco producers in northern Greece and the major cigarette manufacturers. Alternative options were the cultivation of more dynamic products like cotton or dairy products and the migration abroad. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dimitri. I thought that it would be maybe one way to proceed is I give some comments and questions to the three people who have presented, and then we can answer, and then we can open it up for the rest of the public. Herman, I found your paper very interesting. You have explored this issue of credit and how having control over credit markets allowed businessmen to have a competitive edge over others. I have a number of. I have three questions. One is your story. Is it compatible with the narrative, with the Stoyanovich narrative of the conquering Balkan merchant, Orthodox, and so on, or is this something that you think should be ditched? It doesn't really help us anymore. Whatever you might answer to that, what is the place of cultural factors or in religious ties or communal ties in all this thing that you're telling us? You mentioned Jews avoiding some of the problems that Orthodox Christians had in the Ottoman Empire. You refer to credit as or to financial services as one way of creating value or adding value. I was wondering whether it is that, or one, or a mechanism that allows you to obtain value at a different point along the chain. More specifically, is controlling the credit market per se something that gives you value, or is it something that allows you to get better prices when you buy or when you sell, and that's what gives you the value? I'm not hair splitting here. I think this can bring an issue of prices and how these commercial networks expand onto the countryside, and how giving credit to the peasants can allow them to get better prices or whatever, or a more secure supply or something like this. And this brings me to my last comment about your paper. You distinguish between, you refer to formal and informal sources of credit. I was wondering if that distinction is clear and or useful, because at the end of the day, if the credit has to arrive to the level of the peasant, sometimes there will be some intermediary, even though the credit might come from a bank or something like this. So that for Herman. Dimitri, one thing that you didn't say in your conclusions, but that I kind of draw as my own conclusion from the story that you told us, is that, could we say that that the peasants or the tobacco growers had a say in the creation of the Greek post-war establishment, like the institutional framework that emerges out of World War II is not just the story of the right defeating the left and Americans and the British having a say in what happens and the Cold War and so on, but that peasants had a say, or at least indirectly influenced the structure of the National Tobacco Board, EOC, or of other institutions. And last, for Tryfonas, so you have shown that tobacco growers in Greece responded to prices positively, meaning that if prices were high, they would then grow more tobacco, or either more people would grow tobacco, or they would grow tobacco on more land or more intensively. I was wondering what the place of production costs would be here, because of course prices, if they're high, but production costs go up, then you get your margin is not as great. And if that's something that could be worked on, or that could explain some of these distinctions between different varieties, between different. Those are my questions. Herman, go ahead.
Sorry, Juan, you cut out for about 30 seconds. So you might want to revisit the last question you asked, at least the last part of it.
To you, or to Tryfonas, or
To Tryfona.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, Tryfona. So my question had to do with production costs. Is this something that can be quantified? There are data. Is there any way you can go around whatever shortage of data you may have? What is the place of production cost here, and how could you address this? Or do prices still matter to an extent that production costs, even if we don't have them, they still matter greatly? That's all. So Herman,
Yeah, so I have a number of thoughts on your questions. The first question about the conquering Balkan merchant is a tough one, because it opens up this historiographical can of worms. But I'll say just briefly that I think in some ways it may still have purchase, but in many ways it's outdated, in the sense that at least in my particular case, in the case of late Ottoman tobacco, many of the most prominent actors are not Orthodox, right? And many of the most prominent actors are Jews, Donme, and Muslims. And so this sort of shifts the framework for understanding that late political economy and the role of Greek Orthodox merchants within it. And I would say also that some of the Greek historiography, for example, Paris Chronakis' work on Jewish networks within Salonika, are hugely important for dispelling some of those assumptions. More to the point, though, of religious and cultural ties within the region, I try to lay out in the paper, and this is something I'm trying to develop more generally within my work. I think that the political economy of tobacco is one that's very much regional specific, and it comes down to even the village level. So if, for example, Prosotsani is supplied by Muslim labor for the most part, and parts of the labor force in Xanthi are dominated by Greek networks, the relationship between merchants in those two places, the relationship between religious communities in those two places will be different. This is also true, for example, from the 1870s onwards, with the relationship between Slavic speakers and Greek speakers in the tobacco trade. We have an increasing levels of violence between the two communities as they come to terms with who, whether it be Greek Orthodox or patriarchist or exarchist, to use the official terminology, which of those communities will actually dominate certain tobacco exporting networks. And what's difficult to determine in some cases is who actually dominated the specific village-to-village networks from, say, Prosotsani to Drama or to Kavala, because of the fact that many times those networks were smuggling networks. So there is limited official documentation on what was actually taking place, who was doing it. So we have to compile sort of anecdotal evidence to put together certain stories, and we can understand a certain amount, but it's limited. That's a long-winded answer to the first question. I think the other questions are fascinating as well, though. Your question about financial services, whether or not they create value or not, this is actually crucial to the paper and crucial to my work more generally. I think that what I'm trying to argue here, I don't know if I'm fully convinced by my own argument, but I think that in this case, these official, quote unquote, official credit networks of the Alatinis, the commercial company, and the Regie itself are obtaining value, as you put it, or seizing value, but not necessarily creating value in a sort of economic sense. However, their ability to dominate credit markets and also obtain key political privileges to export to the Austro-Hungarian monopoly and also to Egypt, these allow them to avoid transaction costs and risk factors that are then passed on to other merchants, most of whom are Greek speakers, who often have connections with other European networks and political privileged systems, such as the consulate networks, but still they don't have the right connections, right? And so political networks, as well as domination of the credit market, allowed these merchants, these commercial elites to seize value. Whether or not they created value in the credit transactions themselves is a separate question. And I would say that the creation of value within the credit system may not be as obvious within these sort of official networks, but it does become more significant within the unofficial shadow economy credit system, credit market, if you will. And this is why I make the distinction, actually. Partly I make the distinction because it has some purchase within the Ottoman field. Some other historians have used it, but I think my specific reason for using it is because the unofficial and the official avenues for credit corresponded roughly with the networks of tobacco merchants who had official privileges, allowing them to avoid tariffs and so on, and those who had to resort to smuggling to avoid the state and avoid the monopoly itself. So that's why I make that distinction and why I think that in this particular case, it's significant. I don't like the terminology of informal and formal credit markets in general. I think it can be quite vague, but here it means something more specific.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Herman. Dimitris.
Yeah, sure. So because my presentation was already kind of long, so I didn't speak a lot about the configuration of social forces that were like posing for the establishment of a OC. But what we have to keep in mind here is that, like, since the 1940s, we have the emergence of a cooperative movement. The most known representative of that is Passes, and they also established a company, Seke, that one will tell us about it. And this was one of their main instruments in which they demanded for the establishment of a FAO and to subsidize their income and to establish price floors, etc., etc. So this was not only state-centric or only a policy oriented by the state. However, I tried not to speak about it because if I had tried to speak about how the state tried to recouple its northern Greek region to the production networks, and also to speak about the social forces, and also how those forces, those social forces, like saved these connections, which have been too big, and it's two different topics. So I try to keep it for one. However, the last thing is that in the case of Greek tobacco producers, a lot of them knew that being a farmer, being a tobacco producer was something temporary, something that they would like to change. They would like to open a shop. They would like to become a clerk. They would like to migrate to the city. They would like to migrate to Germany. For them, upward mobility is to stop being tobacco producers. So in this regard, I think the mentality of the state, and to a certain extent, the mentality of like mainstream economics about how they would encourage those producers to adopt to employ to other sectors, kind of corresponds with how these people were thinking about it. Interestingly, and this is my last point, this upward mobility was mostly about Christians. To go back a little bit to what Herman speaks, the Muslim tobacco producers in Western Thrace continued to cultivate tobacco more or less until today. When I was speaking with a friend from Xanthi and Stavropoli, asked him who cultivates tobacco right now, I said the Pomaks, the Bulgarian-speaking Muslims of Western Thrace. So this tells us a lot how there are always obstacles to who has access to this upward mobility, even in post-war Greece. So yeah, that's for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. Go ahead, Tryfonas.
Okay, thanks for your question. So my main idea was the following. We try to determine production volume or production changes, increases or decreases. So the first thing I thought it was, let's check price changes as the main determinant of production. Of course, this is a very simple regression analysis. Of course, we know that there are many other factors affecting production volumes, and basically most of them are non-price factors. So the power of institutions might be much more greater compared to the influence of prices. The problem is that we do not have data available in terms of cost. So the only thing we know is some farm incomes, but in a very restricted time period and not in a very deep level. So we do not know anything about farm incomes in provincial level or in city municipal level. So we have some information just for the aggregate level, which means that we are restricted in a very short period. We know something about industry workers, so tobacco workers in manufacturing, but this is also not very correlated with what happens in the farm level. So to skip this problem, my second idea was to implement a kind of input-output analysis. So we threw out prices and we work trying to investigating changes in the production level using available data such as technological availability in an area. So machines, tractors, pumps, some machines that may be correlated with the tobacco production, and of course availability of lands used for tobacco cultivations, and of course data on labor, so workers, but still in total agricultural sector we do not know exactly how many of them they worked in a tobacco industry. So that's the main problem, is that we are kind of restricted to work with that kind of data without having a lot of information in terms of costs.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. So now it's the time for us to see if anybody in the public would like to chip in and ask any question or make any comments. You can raise your hand or write something on the chat. You raise your hand, I think, by clicking on some little icon down there. Yes, Ernst Langthaler, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Juan. First of all, let me say thank you to the presenters of the 3 papers. All of them were very interesting to me, although I do not know much about tobacco. Yes, all of you talked about tobacco as a commodity, but you didn't tell us much about what is special about tobacco. I mean, especially the biological properties of this plant and its products. The background of my question is that I'm dealing with another commodity, namely the soybean. We will talk about it next week. And what is special about the soybean is that you can use the whole bean, or you can crush the bean and separate the oil from the cake. And therefore, the soybean is a very flexible commodity, because in some contexts, oil is the main product and cake is the byproduct. And in other contexts, you have cake as the main product and oil as the byproduct. So it's a very flexible commodity, and this flexibility depends on the biological properties of this crop. So my question to all of you is, how do the biological properties of the tobacco plant and its leaves impact on how it can be commercialized on markets? So how does the biology of the plant impact on your story you told us?
Okay,
I hope this was clear enough.
It was clear, Ernst, thank you. Let's gather a couple interventions first. Chinoso Henry Oriaku, please go ahead. You need to click on the mute or unmute button.
Yeah, I've done that. I've done that now. So hi to everybody, and I want to appreciate the 3 speakers. Though I was unable to hear the first and the second speaker due to network challenges, but I was able to hear Mr. Dimitris, and I have 2 questions for him. Firstly, you mentioned something about the financial capability or the financial status of the tobacco farmers in Greece, and you told us that the tobacco farmers in Greece were poor. I want you to expatiate on that, because from my own experience in Nigeria, I discovered that most of the tobacco farmers, though they were poor, but they were still also, some of them, they were able to make some good living from the tobacco trade, because some of the farmers involved themselves not even only in farming, but they also involved themselves in the export chain, and that also fetched them good money. So I want to know, why was it that all the farmers that were involved in the Greece tobacco trade was poor? Was it a generalization, or are you just suggesting or something? So I want you to expatiate more on that, because from my own experience, I discovered that some farmers in Nigeria that participated in tobacco trade, it was a mixed experience. Some were poor and some were rich. I don't know, maybe that was also the same thing in the Greek setting. So I want you to expatiate on that. And another thing again, you mentioned, you painted the picture that the attitude of the government in respect to tobacco was kind of dull, or maybe it was kind of weak. But after some time, he also told us that there was a change of attitude in the government in respect to tobacco. So I want to know, why was it that there was a change in attitude from in the part of the government and EOK? Sorry. Why was there a change in attitude? What triggered the change in attitude? Why was it that the government now wanted to involve themselves in tobacco? What was the change? What was the reason that made the government wanted to involve themselves in change? Thank you very, very much.
May I? Okay.
Thank you, Chinonso. Hold on, Dimitris. Let's see
Yeah,
if
yeah, of
somebody
course, of
else
course.
wants to add something. Okay, so maybe Dimitris, you can answer Chinonso's questions, and then you can all answer the question on the biological particularities of tobacco.
So, okay. Okay. Before I go to Chinonso's questions that are very interesting, something about biological properties of tobacco. The reason that Oriental tobacco was so popular for cigarettes was because the specific climatical conditions of northern Greece and the soil there. That was very low. They had very low productivity, not a lot of rains during the summer. That would make a yield that each tree would have very few leaves and would be kind of dry, and they would give like a sweet flavor with low nicotine. And that was very different than the taste of tobacco, let's say in South America, where it originated from Bolivia, things like that. And so this is something, and that's why I spoke in my presentation that like northern Greece had access, Turkey and Bulgaria had access to a very, very specific version of tobacco necessary for cigarettes that you couldn't find anywhere else in the world. So it could have like a monopoly of Oriental tobacco if those three countries could cooperate. As simple as that. That's what was my whole point about integrations, world economies, lead firms, etc., etc. So, thanks so much. So, the two questions of Chinonso, and very, very fast. The first, tobacco producers were not richer than other producers in Greece. We're more or less at the same level. Maybe sometimes it would be like a little bit richer, but because tobacco was sold quite expensively, was exported in quite high prices, when those producers came to Greece from Turkey, from Asia Minor in the 1920s with the extensive population, Greek state gave them very small lots of land. So 1.5 hectares of land per family. So their land was very, very limited. So even if the price of tobacco would fall slightly, their income would decrease drastically. They didn't have a lot of land, so to recompensate when the price of the tobacco fall. This is, if I understood correctly, your question. And the other thing is that these people, because of the soil of the northern Greece, could not easily cultivate something else, another agricultural product that could be exported, because it was not fertile land. So this, and about the change of attitude of the state, very briefly, in the mid-late 1950s, the state understood that without intervening the market to the tobacco market, they would be the cultivation of tobacco in Greece would almost collapse, because every year more land was cultivated, more tobacco was produced. There was expectation for this tobacco to be sold, less and less, and not enough quantities were exported to the Western Greece. And interestingly, the international economic institutions that were guiding Greek economic policy, let's say IMF and things like that, and US as well economic advisors, were okay with Greece giving subsidies to Greek tobacco producers. This was something acceptable in the context of a Western semi-liberal economy in the post-war Europe and Northern America. United States was doing it as well. And in this conjuncture, even the governing party, that was a conservative center-right party, embraced the establishment of FEOC, of this organization, and the subsidies to the producers. Lastly, we have to keep in mind that, like in parliamentary democracies, the people who vote in the countryside tend to have more political power than the ones that are living in the city. So what I'm trying to say here is that trying to accommodate to a certain extent their interests and their needs can more easily translate it into political influence. And that's why we see very often conservative center-right parties to support subsidies and welfare policies towards people that live in the countryside. So that's for me. Thanks so much for your question.
Herman, anything to add about properties?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of commentary on this question, but I'll just say briefly, perhaps it seems like common sense, but one of the most important biological features of tobacco in terms of it being a market-oriented commodity is its addictive nature. And this seems obvious, right? But what this very addictive quality allowed for in at least the early modern and 19th century up until the beginning of the 20th century was a variety of forms of consuming tobacco. Of course, it's not as adaptable as, say, soy. You can't make vegan sausages out of tobacco, but you can use it for many different types of consumption. There was snuff tobacco to be snorted through the nose. There was chewing tobacco, even in those early periods. And there's nargile, there's different ways of smoking it. And other medicinal uses for it, including if you read the early Islamic manuscripts on tobacco consumption, it fits very well with humoral theory, the theory that it has the biological features necessary to rid the body of phlegm. Of course, this doesn't cohere well with our understanding of the product now, the products produced from tobacco now, but it's important for the history and the development of tobacco, I would say. Yeah, I suppose that's about all I have to say on the question.
Thank you, Herman. Tryfonas, anything to add in this regard about the biological characteristics of tobacco?
No, the only thing, just in the more general framework, I mean, the answer of why tobacco was or why it's so important, my answer could be that we can use the land for cultivating tobacco in a quite mixed way. That means that we have some kind of complementarities of tobacco production with other kind of agricultural products, and some of them food products. So this is an interesting relationship between industrial plants, such as tobacco, and food crops, which are in a way are complementary each other in many sense. And of course, the adoption of new technologies is another specific characteristic, in the sense that tobacco, it seems that perfectly attached to modern technologies such as irrigation systems. So we moved from traditional varieties to some new varieties such as barley and Virginia in a very easy way compared to other agricultural products in which we were very much more restricted in terms of flexibility.
Okay, Tryfonas, thank you. I would like to add something about the biological characteristics of tobacco. Myself, as somebody who also researches the topic, of course, which characteristics are relevant depends on the historical question you're trying to ask. But when we talk about the crisis of the tobacco sector in post-war Greece, which is why the state would buy tobacco and why prices were monitored and which is why we have data and so on. There are two things. One is the flavor of the type of tobacco that grew in Greece, which because of its low nicotine content and its specific sugars and fats, it gave a very nice flavor to cigarettes. Cigarettes have a mixture of different types of tobacco. Now, after World War II, these properties of tobacco, this specific flavor of the Oriental type tobacco, were less and less marketable because of changes in cigarette production. You have new technologies, you have filters on, you have artificial, consumers turning to more high nicotine products. So that's one side of the biology of tobacco, of the characteristics of tobacco. The other side is that it was very well suited to the specific soil and climate of northern Greece. So when they did the land reform and they give very small plots of land to the Greek farmers of northern Greece, they said, your small plot of land is good for tobacco. Now, when land is good for that type of tobacco, it means that it's not great for other crops because tobacco benefits from the low content of nutrients. This type of tobacco, if the leaf is too strong, the quality falls. So you want a weak leaf, so you have to balance yield and quality. So this poor land was suited for tobacco, but then it was hard to pivot sometimes to other properties, to other crops. So the state has to do something about it because people can't pivot. In a sense. Next, we have a question from David Rands. He asks on the chat whether cultural connections to land impact tobacco production or land value. Does the value of land or the price of land impact all this story? But can land be shifted to other uses, or what were the computed uses of land? Dimitris, you have addressed this. If you can expand on that.
Yeah, so what happens is that, and Juan also has spoken about this, like people have written about this. What we need to keep in mind that in 1920s and 30s, there was a rupture, there was a radical break in land ownership in northern Greece. Most of the habitats of northern Greece were Muslims or Slavic-speaking Orthodox Christians, etc., that had to leave the country and migrate forcefully to Bulgaria, to Turkey, etc. At the same time, Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians that spoke Turkish were forced to migrate to northern Greece in the 20s, and this change kind of erased the connections with the land and other cultural links that we would have if this hadn't occurred, and like certain traditions. So it was like almost like a terra incognita. It was like it was like a white paper. And as I once mentioned, like those immigrants came and the state told them, okay, here you have to cultivate land, learn how to cultivate land, tobacco, end of story. It was not something that was like an organic part of their community that they knew, etc., etc. So this is something we need to keep in mind. And second, the value of this land, as Juan mentioned, was very low. It was in the borders of the Greece, it was in northern Greece, nobody cared about that, it was not highly sought after, it was not expensive. There was a lot of alternatives for people who own this land. So this was also an important thing. Like it wasn't like land in southern Greece that would have like cultivate cereals or olives or grapes or vegetables, etc., etc., etc. So it was also an issue. So that's about as far I can say about the plot of the land. Yeah, about the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris.
Can I add this?
Go ahead.
Yeah, one quick point I would like to add is that I think another important aspect of land ownership that we should keep in mind during the transition from from Ottoman rule to Greek rule, and then Bulgarian occupation, and then back to Greek rule, and so on and so forth, is that the transition from what's the word for it? The absentee landlords, Muslim absentee landlords over much of northern Greece, the transition from their ownership of the çiftlik system, the çiftlikia, to a system wherein smaller plots of land are distributed to a larger portion of the population is, as Dimitris mentions, it's a significant shift for many reasons. But one reason that I just want to highlight very briefly is that it also is an aspect of agriculture which continues to shape international relations, transregional relations between Turkey and Greece. Because after 1924, after finally the Muslims begin to be expelled after the signing of Lausanne a year before, the actual transfer of the Muslim population out of the region took some time. Once that process actually gains momentum, there are a number of legal disputes that continue on until the 1930s over these lands and how these people would be properly reimbursed for their losses. And so I think it's important to think about the ways in which the Greek and Turkish governments relate to one another over this question, or perhaps the way that they both tend to obfuscate and ignore the actual question to try and move on. And eventually in 1930, that is what they do. They move on from the question. They don't properly reimburse either population. And it continues to be an open wound for the following decade or two, at least.
All right. Well, we have gone beyond the 1 hour and 40 minutes. So I'm going to thank everybody for to the presenters, of course, and also to everybody who attended and participated in this event. Before I let you go, before concluding, I would like to remind you that on September 15th, that is 1 week from now, we have another panel of the workshop series. I will be sending around the relevant announcements. We will have Professor Ernst Lang-Thala, who is with us today. He will talk about his research on soy and agri-food transitions. I will be presenting myself on agricultural cooperatives in Greece and tobacco exports. We will also have Nikos Alexis talking about the connections of the Greek cigarette industry with the foreign cigarette companies. So that's all for today. Thanks everybody, and wishing you a good rest of the evening. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.